Thank you for staying on this long. Showing considerable stamina, more than you used to show when you ran. Just got a few questions to finish off with. Firstly, on the question of the way that the Cabinet was involved in the policy as a whole, and your diaries are pretty illuminating on Cabinet discussions on Iraq. Jack Straw, I think, said that the Cabinet discussed Iraq 28 times between September 2002 and March 2003, but the Butler report commented on the fact that there was a remarkable absence of papers for these Cabinet discussions. Why weren't there papers for the discussions?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I mean, my job was not preparing papers for Cabinet.
No, but you were an intimate advisor in Number 10. You might have known why these Cabinet discussions didn't have the sort of papers that would be normal in Cabinet, but you don't know.
My sense as well is that there were a lot of debates and meetings with the smaller group that I talked about earlier. Prime Minister, sometimes John Prescott, Jack Straw, Jeff Hoon, and then there was a broader, once the War Cabinet came into being, Gordon Brown, David Blunkett. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the whole grouping, but that certainly would be a group of people that I assume was being serviced with papers properly.
But the Cabinet as a whole had to take responsibility for the decision, as of course subsequently did Parliament. Claire Short, Cabinet Minister at the time, said in her book An Honourable Deception, there is a great difference between the Cabinet being updated each week on the events they're reading about in the press and any serious discussion of the risks and the political, diplomatic and military options and the hammering out of an agreed strategy to handle the crisis. Now, did the Cabinet in 2002, early 2003, as one approached the conflict, at any stage have a properly informed debate, not a briefing, about the strategy?
Yeah, they did. I mean, look, I think the Prime Minister once said in a different context that if he thought the first time he was aware of a difficulty within the Cabinet or people who had very, very strongly opposed what he, as the leader of the Cabinet, the Prime Minister was saying or doing, if the first time he knew about it was when they got to the Cabinet table, he'd think these political systems weren't up to much. So it's true that there were lots and lots of discussions outside Cabinet, and I can see why sometimes people might have thought, well, he's just kind of bringing us up to date. And sometimes that was all that there was, in a sense, to do. But I was certainly present at Cabinet meetings where really pretty vigorous discussion went on, and also where I think, look, obviously, those inner people, Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, the people who were involved in the ongoing discussion that was really sort of 24/7, they probably would be taking the lead. But then I think what others were doing who maybe weren't directly involved in the day-to-day formulation of policy, they were challenging, they were testing. We talked about one meeting where I think there was David Blunkett and Margaret Beckett and others who were raising questions. Often I think was Charles Clarke, the chairman of the Labour Party at the time, but often there'd be both he and the chief whip giving very, very frank assessments as to what people were saying, what people thought, what their concerns were, and the Prime Minister then having to engage in that. But I mean, you will know from your discussions with him as well that I think that sometimes it's said that well, the last Labour government used to have Cabinet meetings that went on for 1 or 2 days, and I think the Prime Minister would not think that was a very effective form of Cabinet government. He would know what his ministers and his colleagues were thinking, what concerns they had, and the Cabinet table was often where they were threshed out.
Why wasn't the Secretary of State for International Development included in this inner circle of people, given that her department was going to be the lead department on questions to do with humanitarian relief and quite a lot of the dealing with the aftermath of the conflict as well as with its humanitarian consequences?
That is a very good question, and I think in an ideal world, the Secretary of State for International Development would, should, and could have been in all of those discussions. I mean, how can I put this? I think it's fair to say that when... Well, let's just step back a bit. Cabinet government. People have talked about Rumsfeld in America being difficult for the president sometimes to deal with. Cabinet, in the end, they're appointed from within a fairly narrow pool, MPs, peers, a small number, and sometimes you have to make political. You've been there when John Major was putting together cabinet. Sometimes you're putting together different political factors.
I didn't work in the political capacity.
No, but you know sometimes how difficult it was to organise a reshuffle and put together a cabinet. And so the point I'm making is you'll get a collection of individuals of variable competence, of variable trustworthiness in the Prime Minister's eyes, and sometimes he would want to have discussions with a smaller group of people.
Are you implying in your deeply diplomatic way that the Secretary of State for International Development was not regarded as trustworthy or as competent?
When Claire Shaw was and her department were in support of a government policy or position, then I think she was both trustworthy and competent. And I think there are people you can talk to in DFID who say that she was terrific at every level. And I can remember, for example, during the Kosovo crisis, to go back to that, Claire did an awful lot of pretty extraordinary work at the time. But look, it's no secret here, she was very, very difficult to handle at times. I think sometimes the military, and I think that emerged in the evidence of some of your earlier witnesses, I think the military found her approach to them quite difficult to deal with. I think sometimes there probably were concerns at times about whether very, very sensitive and tightly held conversations as to whether in a political environment, whether sometimes you'd maybe be a little bit worried that things would get out into the public domain that you didn't necessarily want to get into the public domain.
So because
that's diplomatic as well.
Because she was difficult, her department couldn't therefore be included fully in the work. They didn't receive, as we've heard from earlier witnesses, the Iraq options paper of March 2001. She heard about it later and complained.
I found that. I must admit, I did find that surprising.
You found that surprising? Yeah. It was sent out from number 10, but they were not on the distribution. That wasn't a sensitive document. She asked for an intelligence briefing again, she says in her book, in September of 2002, and initially was told by SIS that she couldn't receive the briefing on orders from number 10. A similar story over military briefing. What were the consequences of this for the government's, as a whole, ability to plan effectively for the aftermath of the conflict?
Again, I'm not an expert on that side of government policy and planning. I mean, I think it would be, obviously, if you had really good, strong, harmonious working relationships right across government, then I suspect that hopefully your government machinery and its operations would be improved. And I know that there were times when people who were out there, and you've heard from some of them who said that, we just had a sense that DFID was just a bit, some elements of DFID were just a bit disengaged from the whole thing. Whereas in previous situations where Claire Short was very supportive of the overall position of the government, those people would be able to really get stuck in. I think it was something that was difficult, but I hope correctable in a fairly short time frame. I don't think, for example, if you get onto the aftermath, I don't think you can say that was the reason why things went so as bad as they did at times in the aftermath. But would it have helped to have had better relations? Almost certainly.
Yeah, it certainly didn't help.